Imagine trying to draw the whole world, but you've never left your hometown. You've never seen a globe. You don't even know Australia exists. Welcome to the life of a 15th-century cartographer. These guys weren't exactly Google Maps. They were more like guess maps, half science, half imagination, and sometimes half sea monsters. Their job? To make the world look important for kings, sailors, and church leaders while secretly guessing what was on the other side of the ocean. Think of it like when a kid is asked to draw a dinosaur. They don't really know what it looked like, so they just add spikes, wings, and fire breath for fun. Medieval mapmakers did the same, except with dragons, mermaids, and giant fish swallowing ships. And here's the kicker, people trusted these maps. Imagine if today's GPS told you, turn left at the Kraken, then right at the edge of the world. You'd laugh, but in 1450 that was cutting-edge navigation. So today we're going to learn how to map the world like a 15th-century cartographer. Bring your quill, your compass, and your wild imagination, because the world back then was less geography, more fantasy novel. Before the 15th century, the world was basically a giant mystery box. Most people never travelled more than a few miles from home. For them, the Earth wasn't a globe, it was more like a flat pancake with strange toppings. Politically, Europe was a messy neighbourhood. Imagine a street full of feuding families, each one claiming their house was the biggest and most important. You had kingdoms like Spain, Portugal, France and England, all elbowing each other for power. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church was like the strict landlord, telling everyone how the world should look. Literally. The maps of that time weren't for fun. They were tools of power. If a king saw a map that showed his kingdom bigger than his neighbours, he smiled. If a sailor saw a map with fewer monsters, he felt brave. And if the church wanted Jerusalem in the middle of the world, guess what? That's exactly where mapmakers put it. Now, who were the big players? Portugal and Spain were like the adventurous kids of the block. They wanted to explore the oceans, find new trade routes, and get rich on spices, gold, and anything shiny. So picture this. Europe was a classroom. The kings were the loud kids fighting for attention, and the mapmakers were the nerds asked to draw a world they barely knew. They filled in blank spaces with creativity, hearsay, and sometimes straight-up nonsense. All right, first rule of being a medieval mapmaker. You don't actually know what the world looks like. You've never seen half of it. Imagine trying to draw the whole Earth using only gossip from sailors, church sermons, and maybe one really drunk traveller who swears he saw giant ants in Africa. Most cartographers began with Europe. Why? Because they lived there. So naturally, Europe took up half the map. And blank spaces were dangerous. They made kings nervous. So, to fill them up, mapmakers doodled monsters, mermaids, and cities of gold. Here's the thing. Maps weren't just about directions, they were about belief. In medieval Europe, Christianity was the ultimate guiding system. Think of it like this. Imagine Google Maps decided to put Disneyland at the center of every map because that's the happiest place on Earth. And east? That's where the Garden of Eden was placed. So many maps were drawn with east at the top, not north. Okay, so you're a cartographer, you've got a quill, ink, some parchment, and maybe a compass. What you don't have? Satellites, drones, airplanes, or even a proper measuring tape. How did they measure distances? Usually by guessing how long it took to walk, ride a horse, or sail a ship. So maps ended up stretched, squished, or tilted like funhouse mirrors. Coastlines looked like spaghetti noodles drawn by someone with shaky hands. Here's the fun part, decorating the oceans. Cartographers didn't like empty space. So what do you put in the Atlantic when nobody knows what's there? Sea monsters, giant whales, kraken pulling ships underwater. Think of it as medieval clickbait. A map with just coastlines? Boring. A map with dragons and here be monsters scribbled in the corner? Now that gets attention. Maps weren't neutral, they were weapons of power. If you were the king of Portugal, you wanted maps that showed your country as big, powerful, and perfectly placed for exploration. It's like Instagram filters for kingdoms. Make me look larger and cooler, please. The Pope even used maps to divide the world. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas literally split the globe in half between Spain and Portugal, based on a line drawn on a map. Not all maps were nonsense. Sailors used something called portolan charts, which were like practical GPS for ships. These charts focused on coastlines and ports, drawn with surprising accuracy. They had compass lines crisscrossing everywhere, so sailors knew where to point their ships. The interior of continents, still blank or full of monsters, but the coast pretty good. Before the 15th century, maps were hand-drawn. That meant only rich kings, monasteries or universities had them. But then came Gutenberg's printing press, mid-1400s, and suddenly maps could be mass-produced. Now everyone could get their hands on a map, merchants, sailors, even curious nobles. But more maps didn't always mean better maps. Mistakes spread faster too. One wrong coastline could travel across Europe like a medieval meme. Let's talk about the most famous map fail, Christopher Columbus. He used maps that underestimated the size of the Earth and didn't even know about the Americas. He thought he could reach Asia quickly by sailing west. Instead, boom, he crashed into the Caribbean. It's like planning a road trip to the mall, but instead you end up in another country. Despite all the errors, medieval maps had something magical about them. They weren't just geography, they were storytelling. Yes, they got distances wrong. Yes, they filled oceans with sea serpents. But those maps made explorers curious. In other words, the cartographers' wild guesses paved the way for real science. 1. Draw your home really big. 2. Put your religion or belief at the center. 3. Guess the rest, confidently. 4. Add sea monsters where you don't know stuff. 5. Make your boss's kingdom look cooler. 6. Sprinkle in myths to keep it spicy. 7. And finally, don't worry about being wrong. That's the life of a 15th century cartographer, part scientist, part artist, part storyteller, and part professional guesser. So what happened after all these creative maps? Surprisingly, a lot. First, explorers got inspired. Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Magellan all relied on these maps, even if they were wildly inaccurate. Without them, the age of discovery might have taken centuries longer. Maps, even silly ones, nudged humans to leave home and explore the unknown. Second, maps became tools of power. Kings, queens, and the Pope used them to claim lands, plan wars, and impress rivals. A map wasn't just paper, it was proof of ambition and authority. Third, cartography slowly became more scientific. Sailors demanded better accuracy, scholars measured distances, and the world started looking less like a dragon-filled fantasy and more like reality. And lastly, culture got a boost. These maps weren't just tools, they were art, filled with myths, stories, and imagination. People learned that exploration wasn't just about land, but about ideas, dreams, and daring to look beyond the horizon. In short, medieval mapmakers turned guesses into journeys, fantasies into exploration, and blank parchment into the start of a global adventure. And that's how 15th century cartographers mapped the world. Part guesswork, part imagination, and a whole lot of dragons. They didn't have Google Maps, satellites, or even accurate measurements, but they had creativity, confidence, and a knack for turning blank spaces into adventures. Their maps were wrong in so many ways, yet they inspired explorers to sail across oceans, kings to expand their empires, and eventually the world to understand itself better. In other words, being confidently wrong sometimes leads to surprisingly right results. So next time you open a modern map or GPS, remember the medieval mapmaker, the person who put Jerusalem in the center, added a sea monster in the Atlantic, and somehow helped humans reach the other side of the world, all with a quill, parchment, and a wild imagination. Mapping the world may have started as a fantasy, but it ended up changing history. And that, my friends, is both terrifying and awesome.